question about the book of Esther, and that is, were the Jews that stayed behind instead of going back home, were they disobedient, or were the Jews okay to stay like Esther and Mordecai?
Wow. Are you talking about the Jews that stayed behind in Babylon and didn't go to the Promised Land with Ezra? Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, I guess, did you all hear that? I heard it right here. Did you all hear his question? No? You didn't hear John's? He asked, and look in the book of Ezra, it talks about, he mentioned Esther, because that's an example of the people that stayed. But in the book of Ezra, we have the listing of the 50-some thousand that go, starting in chapter 2, verse 2. It says, the number of the men of the people of Israel, and then it rattles them all off. If you look, that's one of the more exciting chapters of the Bible, Ezra chapter 2, to read, if you read all that. But basically, by 64, it says there were 42,360 besides, and it goes on and on. But the total number was about 50,000 people that left Babylon to go back to the Promised Land. So Esther and Mordecai were people that did not leave Babylon. They stayed there. And what John Beck was asking, were they disobedient? Well, first of all, they're in a different time zone, time period. Basically, the time period was and all of you have your books, your study Bibles there. But there's Esther, then there's Ezra, and then later there's Nehemiah, and then even later than that we have Haggai, and so we're talking about quite a time period. This, John, is when the disobedience would have been, because Ezra said, come back to the Promised Land, and we're going to return. And so when Ezra came back, and then with Zerubbabel is in there too, they were Zerubbabel. They were calling for the people to return, and then Nehemiah, over the 52 days, built the wall. And then, after the wall was built, Haggai said, how come you guys have spent so much time? In fact, the book of Haggai, what a book to read. In fact, let's turn to Haggai. I learned something that when I teach, I just got back from Word of Life. It's 3 back from Matthew. So just go Matthew and back up Malachi, back up Zechariah, and then you're in Habakkuk. Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. So just before the last 2 books of the Old Testament. But Haggai is calling this group of people, the about 50,000 people that Ezra took, and the multiplied, maybe there's 75,000 of them by the time Nehemiah's building the wall, and Haggai is saying something to them which is interesting. Look at verse 4. Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses, and this temple lies in ruin? That is one of the most timely things. These people that were in Babylon, remember prior to Esther, we have the 586 destruction, 586 BC, the Babylonians came and they destroyed Jerusalem. And those people began from 586 BC to 516 BC captivity. And as they're nearing the end of that captivity time is when Ezra's taken back a group, Nehemiah's come to build the walls, and Haggai is starting to preach to them that God didn't just call them to, look what it says in verse 4, to dwell in your paneled houses and to leave the temple of God. And so basically, what I love to correlate to this, John, is that these people that came back were what we would call 1 Corinthians 3 carnal people. They came back. They were willing to go back for whatever reason, but when they got back there, they really weren't seemingly at the spiritual level. In fact, they didn't really have an interest in sacrificing to build the temple. And so Ezra, if you read the book of Ezra, he talks about he made them all stand up and he read the Bible to them from morning until sunset. I mean, the book of Ezra, even though it's challenging with all those lists of names, is a remarkable story of how you disciple worldly people. See, these people went to Babylon and they kind of liked it, and a whole generation and then another generation came that had embraced the Babylonian ways. And it's kind of like when Moses took the people out of Egypt, it took him a long time to get Egypt out of the people. In fact, God had to kill all the adults that came out of Egypt because he said they were so unbelieving he wouldn't let them go in the promised land. And so what we have here is, instead of killing them, Ezra, and boy, John, what you're asking is so fascinating. This is the time period of the longest chapter of the Bible. See, the Jews credit Ezra during this time period that after Esther and during Ezra's time, the Jews credit this as the time that Ezra, the scribe who wrote the book of Ezra, he took all of the manuscripts from Moses' time and all the manuscripts of the Bible from David's time, and by the time, see, Moses was 1500 BC, David was 1000 BC, Ezra, by the time we get here, Ezra is 500 approximately BC, and by the time we get to Ezra, this is highly influenced, kind of like old Beowulf English. This is like unreadable to a normal Jew because it was kind of hieroglyphic like the Egyptian writing. The Davidic time period was very much, so this was influenced by the Egyptian world of writing, and this was influenced by the Phoenicians. If you remember, David was working with Hiram and all that stuff, and so the writing of Hebrew had morphed from Egyptian writing Hebrew to Phoenician writing Hebrew. Well, these people in Babylon couldn't even read it. So the people didn't even read the Bible, is what I'm trying to say. Even if they had it, they couldn't have read it. And so Ezra begins the monumental task of taking all of the scrolls, the Pentateuch, all the books of history, all the poetic writings of David and Solomon, so the Pentateuch of Moses, the historical books of Samuel and all that, and all of the Psalms and Proverbs, and all these prophets, and 9 of the prophets were done. The major prophets were all done, and 9 of the minor prophets were done by the time of Ezra. And he takes all of that, and he copies it into what we would call, and still is, modern Hebrew. Modern Hebrew, as opposed to the Hebrew of the biblical times, modern Hebrew all fits in a square. You know, you can do Aleph, see how it fits in. It's kind of like almost like typeset. Here's another square, and you can do Beit. He made block letters, is what I'm trying to say. And when he did that, he got all done. He taught it to the people. That's why he had them all stand all day long, and he read the Bible for 8, 9, 10 hours. But when he got all done with that, he took all of the writings, he put it, the 39 Old Testament books we have, and the 3 divisions that the Bible is in, that Jesus refers to. Remember, Jesus said, the law, the writing, the prophets. That division, the 39 Old Testament books that we have, were basically, by the way, Ezra made them into 22 because he didn't break up 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles. He didn't break all those apart. And plus they put together the prophets. They put them as a lump. That's why Jesus quotes, he calls him Hosea, but actually it was not Hosea, but they named the whole roll of prophets Hosea. He was the first one. But all of that was done by Ezra, but he didn't stop there. When Ezra got done hand copying all of the Bible into readable block letter Hebrew, he took that and he made a group of people you still see in the New Testament. Remember the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the whom? Scribes. Those were founded by Ezra, and they were the copyists. So his he started the copyist corps. He instituted them to copy what we call our modern Old Testament, and then he started this. Ever wonder where the synagogues came from? Remember Jesus and Paul? Everybody's going from synagogue to synagogue. Where did they come from? Ezra instituted the synagogues. And by the way, Ezra instituted the readings from the Scripture that are still used today. That's why we know what Jesus read when he went to the synagogue every day of his growing up time in Nazareth, because they still read. We know that he heard the 92nd Psalm every Saturday. That's just part of life, because they had this reading schedule, and they read certain ones on certain days and in between and for the festivals and everything else. But when Ezra got all done with that, copying the Old Testament, instituting the scribes, founding the synagogues and all their reading, the Jewish historical books called the Encyclopedia Judaica. It's like the Britannica, but that's the British American. But Judaica is the Jewish encyclopedia. They say that Ezra wrote the 119th Psalm. And the 119th Psalm has 176 verses for a reason. There are eight is the number of a new beginning. 22 is the number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet. And what Ezra did is he made 22 times 8, 176 verses. So what the 119th Psalm has is 22 stanzas, each one starting with a successive letter of the alphabet, which is called an acrostic. And he made them 8 verses long, which is a new beginning. So what he does is he exhausts the Hebrew language to tell the people that came back from Babylon how they can have a new beginning through God. And that's what the 119th Psalm is. It's a monumental piece written under the inspiration of God for the Jewish people to say, start over again. And that's why Haggai, after he got done telling them that God wanted them to build the temple, they generated so much sacrificial giving that they built the temple rapidly, and it was a marvelous sight. So thanks, John, for asking that. Probably more than you wanted to know, I'm sure. But it is fascinating to see in the New Testament where these folks came from, where this came from that we hold in our hands. These we see all over the world today, and this is a beloved part of our life. And all of those go back to, and the modern Hebrew language, all go back to Ezra. And Ezra was that one that the Lord took to, if we can back up, come on. There we go. Ezra was a part of this whole flow following Esther to go into the time of the faithful remnant in the land, of which Mary and Joseph and Zechariah and Elizabeth are examples of the people that were loving and serving the Lord, reading the scriptures that Ezra, living in the walled city that Nehemiah built in 52 days. And it's just marvelous. But